Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today as we discuss how safety can be enhanced by keeping the human at the center of the decisions we make as an industry. I'm Captain Steve Jangelis, ALPA's Aviation Safety Chair, overseeing hundreds of pilot representatives, all solely focused on continuing to make our very safe aviation system even safer. Welcome to our conference on Train for Life, a human-centered approach to safety. We hope that this conference will provide actionable takeaways for airline management, labor associations, manufacturers, and regulators. The goal is to provide information that will help those at airlines developing airline operations policies, training programs, and new equipment implementation plans, also help manufacturers improve design philosophies, and also help the FAA in establishing regulations and guidance material, which in each case brings human factors to the forefront in a holistic systems approach to improve safety. The areas discussed here, we believe, can provide a way to raise safety to the next level. We've assembled 5 panels that are filled with subject matter experts that I believe will provide us all with points to seriously consider when it comes to ensuring that we as an industry are embracing human factors. With the gracious assistance of our presenters, we believe that we've put together a top-notch agenda that will cover a lot of territory in a relatively short amount of time. We want to ensure that this conference creates a dialogue between presenters and attendees, and for that reason, we're setting aside time for your questions and interaction with these panels. Please avail yourself of the opportunity to ask questions of any of our panelists today. Our moderators will facilitate that for you during each of the panels. Another option for submitting questions is via text. We place cards at each seat with information on how to send those in. Included in your packet of information is the agenda along with the bios of our speakers. In the interest of giving you as much time for dialogue as possible, we will ask that you refer to the bios in lieu of the moderator reading each of them during introductions. You will also note that at your seat is an evaluation form. Please provide us with your feedback on the discussions you hear today so that we may improve our future conferences. The forms may be dropped off at the registration desk when you've completed them. One thing I'd like you to think about as we go through this conference today, I'd like you to think about this. 10 airlines buy 1 aircraft, and for some reason there's 10 different checklists or 10 different procedures. Why is that? Well, maybe we're going to find out today from our panelists and from all of you folks' interaction here today. Without further ado, our first panel is on the subject of resilience. Can we train it? Moderating this panel is FO Leja Collier. Leja is a first officer with Delta Airlines and ALPA's Director of Human Factors. Leja and panel, welcome.
Thank you, Captain Jangelis. I hope you feel that we have put out our best welcome mat for you this morning with opening remarks by ALPA's President, Captain Tim Knoll, as well as the NTSB Chairman, the Honorable Robert Sumwalt. It is my pleasure to moderate our first panel of experts this morning. And as ALPA's Human Factors Director, I also hope that today will provide lots of thought-provoking discussions and practical takeaways so that we can all return to our respective organizations and advocate for more human factors integration. About 4 years ago, I took a break from safety work to change uniforms, learn a new airplane, as well as a new series of manuals. And when I returned, I asked colleagues and mentors, what's new and exciting in the world of human factors? The consistent answer was resilience. And I must confess that I was probably equal parts curious and skeptical, because we want our kids to be resilient. We want our organizations to be resilient. We want our immune systems to be resilient. And now we want our pilots to be resilient. Is this the latest buzzword, or do we need to lean in to resilience? I hope our panel of experts will help us determine that today. Our first panelist is Mr. Shawn Pruchnicki from the Ohio State Department of Aviation. And when I was asking about resilience, I was told, you must talk to Shawn. So I'm grateful that he's joined us today, and he's going to provide definitions so we have a common language. Our second panelist is Captain Brand Donaldson from Alaska Airlines. And it just happened that while I was initially investigating resilience, I also was learning about Alaska Airlines' Briefing Better initiative. And I saw some synergy with some of the things that they were doing. They've incorporated some of Gary Klein's work in recognition prime decision making, as well as some modes of learning. So I'm hoping that Brad will share some of that with us. Our third panelist is First Officer Terry Van Hoose. Terry, much like me, recently changed uniforms, learned a new airplane and a new set of manuals. But back in 2015, Terry was a captain for ExpressJet and was awarded, along with his first officer, the ALPA Superior Airmanship Award for their handling of an event. We've asked Terry to join us here today because so often in our safety systems, we look at what did not go well. And here's an opportunity to look at what went right. Last but not least, Mr. Lou Németh from CAE. And Lou's going to tie this all together and talk about what it means for the training organization. So each panelist will have roughly 8 minutes, and then at the end we'll have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. Without further ado, Shawn, would you tell us what we mean when we talk about resilience?
Sure. Thank you, Leja. First of all, I have to say two things. It's great to be back in front of an ALPA crowd. Boy, have I missed all of you. So I see a lot of friends and colleagues in the crowd, so very delighted to be here today. The term resilience is not a buzzword, and I think we'll be able to hopefully clarify that for you today and why that is. I think one of the things that's really important we need to understand about resilience is it is not the same thing that we're talking about in this context as we do when we say we want our children to be resilient. We want our spouses to be resilient. We want our jobs maybe to be resilient. That we're talking about this in a much different way. And I think that's potentially caused a lot of confusion and maybe caused us to label this as a buzzword. When we're talking about resilience in those settings, we're actually talking about being robust or robustful, right? So this is when we're operating within a semi-normal state with the typical challenges that we expect to face in life. That's being robust. Whereas being resilient is about when we exceed those boundaries. It's about our adaptive capacity. And I was delighted to hear earlier when we were speaking about how human is the best at adapting. And that is absolutely true. We have no automation whatsoever that comes anywhere close to the adaptive capability of a well-trained pilot. Not even close. We do have adaptive automation. You maybe have heard that. There's some of that in research now. But even that form, and I hesitate even following the pack and calling it adaptive automation, because I think in some forms it could be a misnomer. But even those forms of technology come nowhere near what we talk about when we talk about being resilient. Being resilient is when we're operating out of bounds. Being resilient is when we're faced with those conditions which our training has not provided us for. Engine fires, engine failures. These are things that we don't talk about and label them as being crews being resilient. Those are things we're trained for. Those are inbound, so to speak, and exceptionally rare, as this crowd certainly knows. When we do face those, seemingly simple, if you will, a single failure, anything from a single hydraulic system failure to maybe an engine failure or even an engine fire, that's being robust. That's working within your training and the skills that you have and the tools that you have. When we get out of bounds, when we are faced with challenges, and a couple of those were mentioned earlier, US Air 1549 in the Southwest scenario, those weren't trained for, not anywhere close to trained for those. But those crews recognized and used their experience, recognized the situation for what it was, and they adapted. They were resilient. Now, when we talk about resilience, we talk about the four cornerstones: anticipating, monitoring, reacting, and learning. And I don't want to go too deep and get too crazy academic. I know somebody probably thought, oh God, an academic from a university, he's going to kill us with PowerPoint slides and way off definitions. And I certainly don't want to do that. I want to stay focused. But I think it's important you understand that it's not just simply memorizing a definition of what resilience may or may not be, but rather understanding these components of being resilient. So when we start operating out of bounds, when being robustful is not enough to respond to the event, when we're in that event, resilience, part of resilience is anticipating what's going to happen next. This is what we're faced with. And I'd offer a comment that this is all about mental models. This is all, and without getting too deep into the cognitive engineering world, a mental model is our understanding of the world. And this is more than just perception. I think a lot of people think that having a mental model is just what you're perceiving. Your ability to develop a mental model is based on your experience. It's based on your interaction with others. It's based on previous training. It's based on your experience of doing that job. All of that comes together and forms your mental model. But when you're acting or in a situation that is out of bounds, or what Tilly would call a black swan, your mental model becomes very challenging to reestablish. So when we anticipate, when we're being resilient, we're anticipating that situation and what could happen next. I have a working mental model of what has happened, but what could happen next? Where do we go from here? What should I be alert for? And the next one is monitoring. Now this shouldn't be confused with how we monitor, thinking about pilot non-flying monitoring skills and all of that, but rather where do we go in the extreme avalanche of information that we have on our flight decks? Where do we go for the information we need at that time? And once we've established it, do we monitor it or do we need to monitor something else? How we react is the third one. So what skills we bring to the table to be able to react in such an unusual situation. And the final one is learning. And I think that one probably gets the short stick a lot, that we tend to think of learning as a post-event debriefing scenario, right? We all go to the simulator and we have a debrief and we talk about what we've learned and where our strengths and weaknesses are. But that's not the same thing for where we talk about an out-of-bounds operation. Where being robustful is not good enough. We now have to be resilient. Is that we're learning as the event is unfolding. The final comment I would make is resilience engineering focuses on the positive. It focuses on how systems perform and how they perform well. Resilience engineering is not so much about failures. It's not so much about accidents, but it's about looking at the good data. How we get it right almost every single day, every single time. That's where resilience engineering focuses on. That's where cognitive engineering focuses on. It's understanding those. Understanding the incredible adaptive machine on the flight deck, which is you. That's the focus of cognitive engineering. And I think that gives us, hopefully, a little bit of a background on understanding what resilience maybe is and what it is not, and hopefully will serve as a foundation for maybe our further discussion.
I agree. I think that was a great introduction to the topic, Shawn. Thank you very much. Brad, now could you tell us what you're doing at Alaska? Maybe tie it into some of the things that Shawn's talked about. And I'm definitely looking for some of that, the mental model of the recognition primed decision making and maybe some modes of learning that you guys are advocating or championing at Alaska.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leja.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the volunteers, the committee members, and the staff at ALPA. It's an excellent opportunity to come network and learn from other pilots and organizations. I'd also like to give a quick thank you to Alaska Airlines for giving line pilots like myself the opportunity to better themselves, to educate themselves, and to come back and make a better training environment, a better product, a more safe product for everybody out there. So I was asked to come in and discuss recognition prime decision making and how we use these theories at Alaska Airlines to develop our training and actual line processes. Well, recognition prime decision making has its roots in the 1980s with Dr. Gary Klein, and he was doing some research in naturalistic decision making, and that is how decisions actually get made out there on the line in the actual real world. And the basic overarching theory was that there was an analytical thought process that went into how decisions are made in a high-stress situation. And what we actually found through interviewing, it started off with firefighters, is it wasn't as analytical as it was once thought. That when they were getting feedback with how firefighters made decisions with what they were going to do, whether they were going to attack the fire or turn it into a rescue operation or pull back, that there wasn't a systematic analytical setting up of multiple options and then weighing these options against each other for their benefit or detriment. What they found is that the firefighters were simply saying that they knew the answer, that it kind of came to them, and that they never really thought about any alternatives there. And this process became known as recognition prime decision making. And Gary Klein learned that this was being done by the experienced expert firefighters, the firefighters with 15, 20, 25 years of experience. And they just knew the answers intuitively. And this led into books that were written, Sources of Power, based on intuition and how this actually works. And if you look at work by Malcolm Gladwell that wrote the book Outliers, it talks about the 10,000-hour rule. And that's how long it takes for an expert to be able to make knee-jerk decisions that are the appropriate safe decision here. And that metric is pretty good with aviation. 10,000 hours is a pretty good marker to be saying this is an expert pilot that can make decisions on the fly, the right decision. Well, when we look at these decisions and talking about pattern matches, and you were saying a situational assessment of what's going on, we can start to set up a spectrum of decisions that are being made. And at the very bottom level, we're talking about skill-based decisions. And those skill-based decisions we've been training for decades here in aviation. They are simple pattern matches where you don't really go over options. They're things like takeoff warning configuration horns, wind shear, stall recoveries. It's a simple, I see a pattern, I know the proper response, I implement very quickly. Very little cognitive required, you just simply pattern match and go. As we move up the spectrum, we get into a rule-based decision. And these rules can be based on regulations, they can be based on company policies, or very likely just your own experience as you gain more and more time in the airplane. These are things like flying an instrument approach. Coming down to minimums. Well, we've got a rule base there. We've got one of three options. You see the runway, you land. You see the approach lights, well then most likely you can continue to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation, or you don't see anything and you go around. So you know that these rules are your three options there, and we can put pilots in the simulator and we can get them much faster and better at making that decision. Once we move to the top scale, this is where things get really interesting, and this is where pilots need what we're calling insights and expertise. They need a big bag of experience, or more arrows in their quiver, tools in their toolbox, and this experience in order to pattern match. You may not have the exact answer to the situation, but you get one that's close enough, and you go with it immediately. And this is how these decisions are being made in high-stress situations. So when we look at that top level and we know that this is pattern matching from experience, how do we help pilots get that experience? Because getting someone 10,000 hours takes a long time. It's more than a decade out there of line flying. That's not the most realistic, practical, or safe way in order to gain that experience. So at Alaska Airlines, we use 5 practices or kind of guiding principles in order to help us gain those pattern matches more quickly. And the first is read and research. We cannot let pilots turn this job into a simple punching the clock operation. Just come to work, swing the gear, come back, and call it done. We need to remain engaged, and we need to, in a sense, lead the horse to water. You need to provide the crews with safety reports of what's happening in your organization, best practices like we're doing here in the industry. At Alaska, we push that to our pilots on their iPads so they always have this cutting-edge research and internal safety reports to know what their peers are being confronted with. So when they are confronted with something similar, they may not have been there and done that, but they can very quickly pattern match off of someone else's experience. The next one we do is challenge yourself. We want to enforce crews to go out and actually shake things up a little. If you're getting very senior and you can hold the Hawaii flying, which I definitely cannot do, you're not going to be challenged with things like DC in the winter, Southeast Alaska, where we fly 737s on 8-minute segments, low down in terrain. So we want crews to challenge themselves and go out and actually do this type of flying. Which leads me into number 3, which is actually learning from that experience by deliberate practice. And by deliberately knowing all of the levels and being proficient in automation. We tell crews that they're going to be expected to raw data fly the simulator. And hopefully with responsible policies, they go out there and do that in the real world, shutting down autopilots, auto throttles, flight directors, and maintaining proficiency in the real world. So when you are confronted with a situation, you're able to make those decisions and you have the skills in order to do that. When we get down to the bottom, we're talking about debriefing. And debriefing is reviewing what went right and what went wrong, learning from those experiences by reviewing them very quickly. This doesn't have to take a long time, can be done at the gate after block-in. And the last one, which Leja was leading me into, was our briefings. And that's where we've really taken the last 2 to 3 years at Alaska Airlines to really work on our briefings. We had 3 main goals when we re-engineered our briefings at Alaska Airlines. The first one is we wanted them to be threat forward. Using all of the threat and error management that we've been doing in the airline industry, we wanted to bring it to life. So the first thing we do is talk about the threats, whether we're doing a departure briefing or an arrival. The second goal we wanted is open and interactive briefings. And in order to do this, we brought in the pilot monitor to start the briefing. So the pilot flying will initiate the briefing by saying, what are the threats out there? What do you see? And that will cause the pilot monitor prior to the briefing to actually do a little homework, looking at NOTAMs, looking at the weather, looking at the 10-7s, and trying to find threats that are out there. And this causes an open and interactive conversation to establish the plan. Now, the last key there is scalable. We want to be able to change the briefing length based on how many threats are out there. If you're flying 5 approaches into the same airport that you're based out of on a 2-day trip, there's no reason to go through a 5-minute briefing. It can be as simple as this airplane, that runway. Visual to 16 left, backed up with the ILS, we're going to hold short at the center. But that has to be scalable, because if we're doing a highly complex approach, like an RNP into Washington, D.C. here in the snow, limited braking action, that briefing is going to be much different in addressing each one of those threats and utilizing resources to, if you're using the James Reason model, make sure that the threats don't progress through to cause errors in undesired aircraft states. So that's kind of a quick overview of how we take recognition prime decision making to adjust the training and then move into the briefings there at Alaska Airlines.
Thanks, Brad.
Absolutely.
All right, Terry, would you tell us about your event and some of the things that went well?
First of all, I'd like to thank the Airline Pilots Association again for recognizing the crew's efforts on 4291, and Leja for contacting me and allowing me to share what took place. It was Flight 4291 from Houston to San Luis Potosí, Mexico. Leaving about 4 hours late due to a lot of weather and delays at the Houston airport. Weather forecasted all through southern Texas and even into to Mexico. We took off at 11:57 p.m., climbed to 32,000 feet, and then on up to 36,000 feet, trying to find a better ride. At 36,000 feet, we had a pretty decent ride, moments of turbulence here and there, but it was a pretty manageable situation. During the climb out, we had moderate to heavy rain, frequent lightning, and a moderate turbulence throughout. Handed off to Monterey Center, and at which point I noticed the captain's PFD airspeed decelerated about 6 knots. When that happens, you get a little benign, just a CAS message that appears on the PFD, and that was coupled with a SPS advanced message on the ICAS. The SPS advanced message was a byproduct of the CAS message, where your stall protection system is going to function at more conservative values for the loss of airspeed. 2 QRHs would be an option at that point. One would be a miscomparative QRH, and one would be unreliable airspeed. The miscomparator QRH I felt was more mechanical in nature, that it was more mechanically driven for a malfunction. And 3 things came to my mind at that point: was high altitudes, long period of time, heavy moisture. And I felt like that was what our condition was being contributed to, was ice crystal icing. And my knowledge of that was that unreliable airspeed, it would be momentary in nature and potentially could correct itself. I'm a person of faith, and for whatever reason, I knew the page number for that QRH. Asked the first officer to get 1-185 out, and he said, let's go through this, not necessarily act upon it, but kind of get a base plan for if this would continue in a negative way, that we'd be ready for that. We ran through that. At this point, I was fine with continuing. We both discussed it and felt like that, a change in direction and distance, that our problem would correct itself. Moving forward, there were 2 thunderstorms up ahead, a nice gap between them, and the plan was to shoot that gap, make a right-hand turn, and then proceed to our destination. Shortly thereafter, the airspeed indicator on the captain's side began to decelerate kind of at an alarming rate and started getting very, very slow. I didn't believe that it was legit. The first officer side was still holding pretty steady and just kind of continuing at that point, starting to feel less and less like maybe this was the right idea, at which point then the first officer's airspeed indicator began to decelerate. At that point I kind of had enough and knew that that direction of flight was not something that I want to continue in, especially with the weather forecast and mountainous terrain ahead. So we made a collective decision to return back to Intercontinental in Houston. I had tons of gas, so I knew I had options, and we proceeded back to the U.S. Once we checked back in with the U.S. controller, the U.S. controller told us that the ride to Intercontinental was not advised and deteriorating rapidly. And after just coming through there, I knew that the condition that we had was something that I did not really want to go that direction. We had an alternate of Brownsville. The controller at that time of the night had all the frequencies high and low, and I could hear him talking to other pilots. I couldn't hear them, but I could hear them shooting missed approaches and asking them, where they wanted to go next at all the southern destinations. So I knew Corpus, Brownsville, McAllen, South Padre, all that was not an option for us. I thought if we could get the airplane to the west would be better, and so San Antonio came to mind. We got the weather for San Antonio. It was 7,000 over with light rain. Simultaneously, while all this is happening, the airspeed indicators rolled back and were replaced with red X's. The altimeters then started, they were descending. So now we're heavy into the QRH. Autopilot's disconnected, and I'm just flying with pitch and power at that point. Eventually, all airspeed, all vertical speed, all altitude was lost. The ISIS, to me, appeared void, for a lack of a better term. I looked at it, and I thought that is the most useless thing I've ever seen in my life. So just flying with pitch and power, we declared the emergency, and the radio communication was probably 2x5 at best because of the static. The controller actually called us back and asked if we said something, and re-declared the emergency. And then he told us to descend to 18,000 feet and pointed us towards San Antonio. I kind of laughed and I said, 18,000 feet. I don't think he really understands the magnitude of our situation. So we re-emphasized, no altitude. And at that point, they gave us another controller with a private frequency, and that was a much better atmosphere to work with this situation. So using the tables, pitch and power, elementary, but it worked pretty well. As we're coming down, I felt like that I was actually getting rained on in the cockpit. I mentioned it to my first officer, and he said the same thing. And we looked up, trying to find the source of this water, and the overhead panel was so heavy with condensation, it was actually dripping on us. We noticed that the inside of the windshield at that point was completely iced over, with the exception of the heated surfaces. So at this point, we're trying to look at our anti-ice systems, because they hadn't kicked in at this point in an automated situations, how those operate. So we're looking at the representative surfaces with flashlights, hand flying, QRH, papers everywhere. Kind of chaotic, but at the same time it was methodical, and I would call it more conversational between me and the first officer. Deemed that we didn't need for the anti-ice to override the automation, and at that point we were back into a pretty moderate ride, and my concern was more overspeeding or underspeeding the aircraft without any of the information, and then obviously stalling. So I keyed the mic up and asked for the shortest distance out of the convective activity. I didn't care which direction, because I had tons of gas. I just wanted to get to where we could kind of stabilize what we were doing for a little bit. And the controller said, turn left, 270, 60 miles. 60 miles still a lot of time when you're in that condition. We made the left-hand turn and still descending just with pitch and power, and then we took a lightning strike to the left side of the aircraft. So now we have a burning smell in the cockpit, and discussed going to oxygen and O2. Called the flight attendant to make sure that there was nothing in the back that we were missing as far as the smoke and so forth, and deemed that that was probably not necessary at that point, and just continued down with the pitch and power. Around in the high teens, I'm guessing, low 20s, my primary flight display began racing in numbers like a slot machine. It became very distractive. And I said I actually was doing better without any information than with this. It kind of stabilized and leveled out. At that point, though, without having anything to cross-reference, I just talked with Mark. I was just going to disregard it as information, period, and continue with pitch and power. Counting on the fact that 7,000 over in light rain sounded pretty good. It eventually descended down, got to around 6,000, 7,000 feet. What I'm assuming was saw some lights on the ground. It was foggy, but my experience has been, you look at a lot of information. A lot of times it's right in front of you, and I think that information is valuable and gets overlooked at times. But I knew that 1 degree of pitch, 60% in one on a clean airplane is around 200 knots. So I was feeling real comfortable with what I had at that point. We shot the ILS to runway 4 and landed in the rain about 2 a.m. As far as what went right, I think first of all, probably, my first officer as a crew, he was outstanding. I think his performance was pretty flawless. I think early recognition was a key factor. Having the QRH out, having a plan in place before we actually needed to execute it, gave us time there. I think that went well. The ASAP program, I think, did its job. It was picking up on some momentary loss of airspeed, and I had been able to read some of that information and was kind of exposed to unreliable airspeed, not in a sense that we had, but just in a momentary sense, but just the familiarity kind of seemed the place to go. Our plan was always adapting from the decision to continue to the decision to return to the alternates to the QRHs and so forth, and I thought we did a pretty good job with that, and especially it comes to mind that our conversation was, again, not chaotic. There wasn't any sense of panic. It was just conversational. I guess the last thing that, when you talk about training for the unexpected, I was hoping to come up with some brilliant statement that would be able to answer that question. And the best I have that I kind of alluded to, in private earlier with Leja was that, you need to be proficient at what is expected so that when the unexpected happens, your problems aren't compounded. And then you're dealing with multiple scenarios of issues to deal with other than, you have to fly the airplane. So, the airplanes will fly. It's remarkable how they can fly with a lot of things wrong. So be proficient at what is expected. And that's Flight 4291.
Thank you, Terry. I am so thankful that with everything that was going poorly, so many things were going well with you and your first officer. Lou. So we have Captain Sullenberger and the Miracle on the Hudson. We have Captain Tammy Jo Schultz and her uncontained engine failure. And we have Captain Terry Van Hoose with his lack of instrumentation. All of these captains and their first officers had to not only aviate, navigate, and communicate, but it sounds like there was a requirement to also innovate. How do we train pilots to do that?
Thank you, Leja, and I'd like to thank the association for having me back after 12 years into retirement. So I'd like to begin by speaking to two conundrums. Chairman Sumwalt talked about, automate or engineer the problem out so that it doesn't become a problem going forward. And I completely agree with that and support that. There's an interesting thing that happens when you do that. The human mind automatically kind of moves on to something else because this automation is taking care of it. So you got so many things going on in the cockpit of an airliner, your mind switches to something else because you know that this other problem's been engineered out or the automation is taking care of it. So that speaks to resilience. In my mind, is that's a challenge that we as trainers and training organizations, training departments are going to have to clearly understand when we engineer the training solution here, is this conundrum between, what's engineered out of the system now, and the human mind naturally wanting to go someplace else because it knows it's taking care of it. And so we're going to have an even higher need for resilience than we perhaps first anticipated. The second conundrum that I'd like to speak to is, for the last 50 years, probably not any training organization in this room, but for the last 50 years, we've been about SOP, follow the book, follow the checklist, don't deviate. Now all of a sudden we're saying resilience. That requires a little bit of innovation. So where's the spectrum between innovation and following the SOP, and how do we bridge these two things in these training programs that are out there around the world? So that's another challenge that I see that as we go to implement this within training. And then the third and the last big challenge I see is the need to socialize this. I mean, this is a big paradigm shift. The socialization within the regulator, within the training department, within management, within the line pilot, to say, I want to continuously learn, I want to engage. It's no longer good enough just to take what the training department gives me. I have to know more, and to be engaged. I see all those as challenges. Can those challenges be overcome? Absolutely, but we'll need the proper socialization and plan of attack in order to implement this within training programs. So I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions.
Well, and before we take any questions, I was wondering if anybody would like to piggyback on what anybody else has said. Maybe even specifically Brad, to some of the points that Terry made. I know when we were talking earlier, Terry brought up, he remembered the page number, pitch and power settings. Can you speak to some of the highlights that lends to with experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, and when he was referring to knowing the exact page number, albeit I'm a man of faith as well, Gary Klein would say that was a pattern match, that he had done that in training prior, and that he knew intuitively where to flip that book based on prior experience. The same thing as the pitch and power, and that gets back into the skills, the bottom level of how we're training these things. And then you get to the more complex decisions that were having to be made because of failures of multiple systems there, which will go back to, it might not be one experience, but it might be a culmination, and it might not be your experience, but it might be something that you read about or some other way that you are making this cognitive link in a pattern match that creates an action to find the safe outcome there. So it's how we develop these pattern matches, and the more you can make, the better, which is where the experience comes from.
Great, thank you. And so underneath the anticipating umbrella, we have briefings that kind of lend a plan. I think Terry brought up something that Gary Klein advocated for as well, and it was beautiful. It's having a plan to adapt. And that was perfect, because sometimes when we have a plan, it becomes a hindrance to seeing cues that the plan's not working. So I really appreciated both of those points. Would anybody else like to piggyback on what someone else has said? Do we have any questions from the audience? All right.
Ken Plunkett, Human Factors Committee at ALPA at Delta Airlines. Thank you all for your presentation. A particular thing, I've been working lately with EFBs, and there's been a raised issue at 2 airlines that I'm aware of where there's a chance they may literally go, we're talking about QRHs and reaching for the quick reference, but 2 airlines have proposed physically removing the paper QRHs and putting everything on the iPad or their tablets. I can certainly see how that may work in the future. I'm concerned about just taking the PDFs, putting them on there, and without a lot of preparation and thought, just because someone's made an administrative decision. What I'd like to know is, from your personal experience, and if we're going to talk about how pilots do things, some of the things we're concerned about with doing just that. And if anybody can address that specifically, that'd be great. Going paper to digital.
If you don't mind, personally, I'm an advocate of the hard copy of the QRH. I think if everybody was trained from day one with an electronic flight bag of some sort, it would be a different scenario. But because there's such a generational gap between pilots today, I think that the hard copy QRH is essential to me until perhaps generationally everybody gets accustomed to the EFB. But I know it was so simple just to immediately reach down and grab it instead of looking to the left, right, whatever, trying to go off of one page to another page and so forth. And to me, I'm an advocate of the hard copy. I don't see that it's that big of a deal to maintain. It's been maintained since aviation forever, so I don't see why it wouldn't be that big of a problem.
I would tend to echo that. I think it would be a mistake to put the QRH electronic only. I think the literature out there, that there are numerous reasons that we could talk about that would support that. Some of which being is that this artifact that we use obviously plays an extremely important role in managing these events. And think about how we use it, and think about the differences between that and an EFB. So for example, we've all encountered this, I'm sure, where you're facing an anomaly and you're not only maybe sometimes trying to figure out which checklist to use, which isn't always clear, but you might be aware of a couple of them that might be applicable. And how many times have you taken a QRH, everyone in the room, and maybe went back to one, stuck your finger in there to mark it, and then go to another one, and then you can flip back quickly and look at that one. This is extremely cumbersome to do with an EFB. And we could talk about this for a long time, but I think that's just one example that the literature would support when we use how we use artifacts. I think it would support the idea that I think it'd be a mistake to remove them.
Brian Moynihan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Moynihan, Alaska Airlines Central Air Safety Chairman, and this was a great talk. And like Leja, I was a little bit late to understanding the resiliency concept. Shawn, I think you did a marvelous job academically explaining it. My question for you all, and Lou, you kind of touched on it, is what would you say to managers at airlines who are themselves just getting it and can conceptualize what you're saying as far as the academic, but how would you actively encourage, or what would you do to encourage people to actually make this real and tangible at their airline? What can somebody who wants to incorporate some of your principles, what could you suggest they do to get started in that?
So, if I may.
Absolutely.
So I find that you have to put it in their language, in their terms, in their frame of reference. When I say their, in management's terms of reference. And resiliency in organizations and resiliency in business is also a big topic right now. So we have to be creative, we have to be innovative, we have to be resilient on how to present this to management in their terms, in their frame of reference, is what I would offer.
I think you have to make them aware that the danger to their operation is when we go out of bounds. And that was, you couldn't be any more out of bounds with your situation. And I think when we think about safety at an airline, and when you're talking to managers, safety of their operation is understanding we're not going to have an engine fire and have a major accident out of that. I mean, that would just be extremely rare that we would have a significant loss of life or something like that. But rather, how are your crews going to perform when we are that far out of bounds? And I think it goes back to the training and how we do our training, that we're trying to grow, or we should be trying to grow expertise. In other words, we should be spending that very precious time in the simulator experiencing what we could call unexpected events. Now, we don't have to make them absolutely crazy like your event was with just failure after failure after failure, but we certainly have to make them more than just a single point failure. And we have to let the crews experience that. Let them go through that. Spend the extra time and the extra money, for God's sakes, in the simulator to give your crews that opportunity to experience this territory. Now, you're not training them. It would be a mistake to say, well, we're going to choose the following unexpected events and we're going to prepare them for those events. That's not what you're doing. What you're doing is allowing them to explore this territory, not only operating as a crew, but as individuals and as members of that organization. And then you're helping them grow expertise that they can apply to when the unthinkable does happen, that I'm sure will be totally different than what they practiced in the sim, but they have grown that expertise in being more resilient. I would tell them that that should be the focus. That's where they should go from a financial standpoint, from a training standpoint, if they want their crews to be truly resilient.
Yeah, so is there another way to do it and not use the simulator? I mean, I should be the advocate up here among all the panelists about using more simulators, and believe me, the value of the simulator in resilience and allowing the crew to do more simulations and experiment in the simulator with, you know, what does this combination of buttons do will, in my humble opinion, make them more resilient because they're allowed to explore in the simulator. But then, you know, the challenge is you get a population of 12 or 13,000 pilots and you want to give them 30 minutes more or an hour more in the simulator. That's a difficult sell, but it is an important tool.
Yeah, I'd also like to add that there's a lot of value in studying when things go right. When we're talking about resilience and we're talking about the incredible safe situation that the Honorable Mr. Sumwalt was discussing earlier, we haven't had an accident in a long time, and there are very few actual cases to study because we actually have a quite resilient operation already. And we need to work on soliciting from crews how they made things go right, because so many times that first slice of cheese or the second has stopped something that would have become an accident. And we need to solicit these stories and experiences of these crews of how things went right rather than how things went wrong, because there's a lot to be gained to take that and multiply it across the organization and learn from that experience there.
Great. Scott Hammond.
Hi, I'm Scott Hammond, Essential Air Safety Chair at Delta. Brad and Lou, you partially answered the question that I stepped up to ask, but it seems to me that one of the issues that we would have if we want to train how to innovate in the simulator, how do you do that? Because if you create an unexpected event that you're going to expose 14,000 pilots to, well, after the first week, it's not unexpected anymore. The next 13,900 know about it. On the one hand, or if you keep making it unexpected, you'll definitely get blowback and criticism from some crews that are saying, well, my training was harder than the other guy's training. So I was wondering how we get to the nut of the problem and around those issues that are certain to crop up.
So I would offer that depending on the pilot group size, you have to create more than one unexpected event because of what you just said with after a week, everybody knows what's going on in the sim. I know one operator who did just that, created 10 different unexpected events in the sim instructor guide to choose at the beginning of the training session. And so he chose, you know, mentally what he was going to offer the crew. You know, are some harder than others? Yeah, maybe. And I guess what I would offer, and I realize it's a very professional environment, but I guess what I would say is, you know, boo-hoo. We go out and fly the line, and sometimes some days are harder than others, right? So deal with it. I don't understand why somebody would whine and cry about that. For those of you that know me, this is just Shawn, right?
I would also say that first pilot of the 1500 got the most out of the operation, that person learned the most. And as an organization, we need to design a work group that understands that failure in the simulator is okay, that if you are learning these things, we need to take away the stigma that says, I need to go through this sim, this 3-day operation, and learn nothing. That should be the point. I should get every answer right. Well, you're getting nothing out of that as an organization in that case. You need to make it okay to get in there and mess up a few times and learn from it and have the pilot not be worried that this is going to follow them for the rest of their career. And that starts from just a professionalism and organizational level to say, look, we are going to make this difficult, not because we want you to fail, but because we want you to learn. If it is not difficult, you are not learning. You are not stretching your capabilities there. So that's up to, again, the instructors to instill that and to make sure that the frontline pilots understand that that is the reasoning behind it.
I think Lou has something to say.
So in addition to what's been offered, not as an alternative to what's been offered, you know, one of the things that was said earlier in the panel that we have to allow the pilots to explore on their own. And so in an unstructured environment, perhaps, in addition to the structured environment that we've been talking up to now, but the simulator is so expensive and it's such a valuable resource to every training department in the room. Maybe we need to look at an alternative, and again, I sell simulators. Maybe we need to look at an alternative to simulation at a lower level, perhaps virtual reality, augmented reality, to allow the pilots to explore on their own. But of course, all of this has to start with the pilot himself. He has to have the desire, the want, the need to be engaged in this. And then he gets into these lower level technologies, perhaps virtual reality or augmented reality, and allow him to explore. And I believe that would be a valuable tool toward resilience.
I would totally agree with that, and would want to add one more thing. There are numerous other domains that have had success with just simply becoming primitive enough to do what's called a tabletop exercise. And at this point, without any more really thought into it, because it's just occurred to me, I would offer that maybe that's something that should be thought about, not in place of the simulator, but as part of that training is to be able to set down, you know, the fire service especially. I was a firefighter many years ago. We gained a lot out of doing tabletop exercises. And it may sound a little hokey and a little corny at first. If they're done right, they can be valuable tools. So with the spirit of just exploring ideas here, I would like to throw that out as a consideration.
Absolutely, and with the spectrum there, you can go on the high-tech simulation, augmented reality, and you can go with the tabletop exercises. We can back that all the way up to just having an open and interactive culture at your airline. Sadly, that pendulum has been swinging the wrong direction. We used to have hangar flying, and we used to just swap stories, war stories, and learn from each other's experience. That changed to maybe getting it once a year in a ground school where everybody would say, oh, there I was, I couldn't believe it. And we would learn from those. Well, now we've moved to this where you're lucky if you see a training crew once a year in a recurrent event. So we're losing all of those touch points now to learn from each other's experience. And a lot of people aren't going to pull out an iPad or read these stories or these safety reports from other people. So I think a long way goes to the ALPA just socials that we do at restaurants and stuff once a month, or at Alaska Airlines, we do a rapid decompression, giving pilots the opportunity on a social level to just share experiences. We used to do it decades ago, and we're kind of losing that now.
Rapid decompression, I love that. We have another question from the audience.
Paul Westfield, Air Medical with FedEx. Regarding the resilience, there's been some research on mental fatigue based on visuospatial intensity, short-term mental fatigue that can cause cognitive degradation. And how does that fit in with resilience in terms of your experiences? Would that impact that? Would that have some? Or have you seen any of that in what you look at in resilience, that there's an impact, or how it would impact?
So in the resilience literature, no, I have not come across the idea of fatigue impacting resilience, although it sounds very intriguing, and now I'm thinking of another study that I can do, which is on a long list of studies that already need to be done. But what I would offer is that the four cornerstones that I mentioned and the other concepts that are components of resilience require higher order thinking. So this is all prefrontal cortex, right? And what's the area that degrades the most when we're faced with fatigue is prefrontal cortex, right? So it's that area of the brain, the front part of the brain. So just based on, it just popped in my head, that idea, I think it's safe to go on a limb a little bit and say, yeah, absolutely, fatigue would affect your ability to be more resilient just from a basic brain structure idea. So that's, I guess, my idea.
Absolutely.
Hello.
Good morning. Captain Mike Michaelis with the Allied Pilots Association. I'm the National Safety Chairman for our union. Couple quick questions. Based on what we talked about here, and one of the things that Brad brought up, and is a thankful thing, but the fact that we have very few accidents to investigate. I'm concerned and have been concerned ever since this new process has taken forward that we are resting on our laurels because we think everything's good, but the bottom line is we are about to embark on a massive change in the pilot force. A lot of retirements, a lot of change coming up, a lot of new guys coming in. And we've spent the last 15 years, 16 years with the most experienced pilot corps that we've ever had in the United States. So our training may not be up to where we are expecting to go off and improve these human factors processes that we're talking about. For example, AQP has taken us to a 9-month training cycle where we used to have a 6-month training cycle. Now, far be it from me to ask for another beating, but on the 6-month training cycle, you had those processes and you actually worked forward to developing those skills that the 10,000-hour guy would be going like it's an automatic response. AQP has also required that they define spots. So you have spots, and like you talked about earlier with the process where the first guy gets really good information out of it, but the other 14,000 guys already know it's coming. Had the opportunity to just go through an enhanced envelope training. And one of the things they're teaching in there is surprise or startle factor. When we used to, at American Airlines, used to go off and have training where we had an extra day or an extra 2 hours of, hey, take the airplane out in the sim, and obviously not the airplane, but take the sim out and fly it through the envelope. It actually enhanced the skills of the guys we got, but now we've cluttered the sim program with so much, you've got to get this square filled, this square filled, this square filled, this square filled, that we're not teaching that resilience of what could happen next. How do I deal with it? What are your thoughts on our current training program, and how could we improve it to the point where we implement all of the things that you're talking about?
I'll quit talking so much here, but the first thing I think I would say is just the words you chose. Do not want to take another beating. Man, that says it so clearly, and we've all felt that way and maybe still feel that way today. If that's how you feel about your training program, then I think that explains it all right there. That's not what that should be about. We should be excited about going to training. We should be excited about growing our skills and seeing some new exciting things that we can draw from. It's not about just checking a box. It's not about just simply saying, we're going to give you some events that you'll never see in your lifetime, and then we're going to grade you on those to extremely strict standards. What a waste of valuable sim time. I mean, I'll just be the first to say it. It's a waste of valuable sim time. It's too expensive, it's too precious, and we shouldn't walk away looking at it that we're being beaten up.
Absolutely.
Anyone else? All right.
Good morning. Paul Koziel, Expressjet Airlines. Awesome. Totally awesome discussion. My question is for Terry. Terry and I were both at Expressjet when we switched from NNO to AQP, and then we went from a technical to a non-technical evaluation process. Terry, you think that training that you received at Expressjet Airlines influenced your decision-making during your event?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we were talking, as the discussion has been continuing up here, I feel that maybe this is obvious, but maybe just not to me, is that we've kind of left the instructor influence out of it, more of the program in general. And I think the individual instructors, if there's a culture shift with them individually, then that makes the training environment and the training scenario much more conducive. And to answer his question, absolutely. I had actually received an unreliable airspeed event in a simulator. It was very benign, but just the exposure to that I thought was extremely valuable. to see that, and that's actually where I remembered the page number from that event. So,
All right, thank you. Well, in conclusion, I would like to thank each one of our panelists individually and also highlight some of my favorite points. For Shawn, I'd like to thank you for being our resilience expert, being the go-to guy, and for expanding the definition beyond what we would get from Webster. Brad, I'd like to thank you for bringing some really practical examples of how we can change the way we train pilots, whether it's from making sure we are planning appropriately, or Captain Dave McKinney and I were recently talking about decision-making skills and how we feel that it's a required skill, but it's something that we don't train very often. So kudos to Alaska Airlines. And then the third point that I really loved about your presentation was that, and this one's personal, is about experience. I'm senior enough to do LA turns, and I know that that's not helping my experience grow all that much. So thank you for your points. Terry, thanks for coming again to Washington, D.C. to share your story with us and for encouraging us to look at events with positive outcomes. And you absolutely nailed it with that point about it's not just a plan, it's not just briefing the plan, but it's having a plan to adapt. And Lou, you are the panelist that I have known the longest up here. Thank you for your commitment to safety. Good enough is never good enough for you, and I love that. And you could be an expert on any panel, and you would be a welcome addition. So with that, a warm thank you to all of our panelists.